Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling Europe between 1815 and the start of World War I in 1914.
A century that began with talk of a concert of Europe, but ended with, well, a very different tune. Definitely.
So we're going to put on our realism, liberalism, and constructivism glasses.
Trying to see how these theories explain what led to such a massive conflict.
Right. Power struggles, diplomacy, the role of ideas, it's all connected.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's set the scene first. 1815, the Congress of Vienna. That's our starting point, yeah.
Europe was in pieces, metaphorically speaking, after the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, I bet.
The Congress was an attempt to, well, put things back together.
Sort of reset button.
In a way, yeah, the big players were there. Austria, Russia, Great Britain.
The heavy hitters.
Exactly. And their main goal, to create a stable Europe. Nobody wanted another Napoleon situation.
Makes sense. So how'd they go about it?
The idea was to establish a balance of power.
A balance of power.
Yeah, like a giant seesaw. You don't want one side to weigh too much or the whole thing collapses.
So no one country could become too dominant.
Exactly. And this, in theory, would prevent any one country from starting a war that could engulf the whole continent.
Smart-ish. But didn't this also lead to what they called the Concert of Europe?
It did. It was a period of, well, relative peace and cooperation.
But you said relative, so maybe not all sunshine and roses.
Not quite. I mean, there was diplomacy, there were efforts to work together. There were also a lot of underlying tensions simmering beneath the surface.
Oh, like what kind of tensions?
Well, the Congress of Vienna basically redrew the map of Europe.
Okay.
Problem is, they often did this without considering the wishes of the people actually living in these places.
Ah, I see. So ignoring things like national identities and whatnot.
Exactly. And this really fueled the rise of nationalism.
Nationalism meaning?
It's a strong sense of shared identity, a desire for self-determination.
Basically, we want to rule ourselves.
Exactly. And this was especially problematic in those big multi-ethnic empires.
You mean like Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, those guys. They were made up of all these different groups who wanted their own states.
Sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It was. And then you have the unifications of Germany and Italy in the mid-1800s.
Right. Major events?
They totally shook up the balance of power that the Congress of Vienna had tried so hard to create.
How so?
Before, Germany and Italy were bunches of smaller states, not major players.
But unification changed that.
Absolutely. Now you have these two new, powerful, and ambitious nations on the scene.
And the existing powers are probably thinking, uh-oh.
Pretty much, it led to more competition, more rivalry, more tension.
Sounds like classic realism at play.
Right. States looking out for their own interests, trying to maximize their power and security.
But it can't be just about power politics, right? There's got to be more to it.
Oh, there's definitely more. We can't forget about liberalism.
Which focuses on
the possibility of cooperation, of states working together.
So not just constant struggle and competition.
Exactly. Liberals believe in things like diplomacy, international institutions, shared interests.
So how did this liberal view play out in the 19th century?
Well, the Concert of Europe itself had some liberal elements.
Right. Diplomacy, dialogue between the great powers.
Exactly. And it did help prevent major wars for a while.
So it wasn't a complete failure.
No, but it wasn't perfect either. And ultimately, the cracks in the system became too big to ignore.
You mean with nationalism rising, new powers emerging?
Right. And then there's the Industrial Revolution.
Ah, yes. The game changer.
It transformed Europe both domestically and in terms of international relations.
In what ways?
Think about it. Railways, the telegraph, steamships.
Amazing advancements.
All of a sudden, information can travel much faster.
Diplomacy could happen in real time, almost.
Exactly. But it also meant crises could escalate more quickly, too.
Two sides of the same coin.
Definitely. And then there's the military impact.
New weapons, new ways of fighting.
Exactly. Breech-loading rifles, machine guns, huge battleships like the dreadnoughts.
Oh yeah, those things were massive.
They led to an arms race, especially between Britain and Germany.
So, not very liberal behavior, huh?
It does seem to contradict that idea of cooperation, doesn't it?
It's almost like the Industrial Revolution gave states more tools for both cooperation and conflict.
Exactly. And this tension between those two impulses, between realism and liberalism, it just kept growing throughout the 19th century.
Setting the stage for what was to come.
And we're back, continuing our deep dive into the lead-up to World War I.
So far, we've set the stage with the Congress of Vienna and seen how big forces like nationalism and industrialization were already reshaping Europe.
Right, and now it's time to really put those international relations theories to work.
Yeah, let's see what realism and liberalism can tell us about this era.
All right, realism first. We touched on the security dilemma before.
How one country trying to protect itself can actually make other countries feel less safe.
Exactly, and it often leads to this spiral of suspicion and mistrust.
Classic example, the Anglo-German naval race we mentioned.
Germany felt they needed a strong navy for trade, for defense, for their place in the world.
But to Britain, the dominant naval power for ages, it felt like a threat.
Of course, this is where realism helps us see how even rational decisions can backfire.
Everyone's just trying to look out for themselves, but it ended up making everyone less secure.
That's the paradox, isn't it? This buildup of military might, not out of aggression, but out of fear.
It's kind of tragic, really.
It is, and realists would say this is just how the world works. No global policemen, no guarantees, so states got to fend for themselves.
Which brings us to another big realist idea, the balance of power.
Right. States are always trying to maintain or shift that balance, make sure they've got enough clout to deter rivals.
And we saw how the unifications of Germany and Italy messed with the balance that had existed since Vienna.
For sure. Plus, Germany's growing industrial and military strength. The other powers were getting nervous.
They must have felt like the rules of the game were changing.
Exactly. Time to adapt or get left behind. Okay, now let's switch gears to liberalism.
The more optimistic view, right? More about cooperation.
In a way, yeah. Liberals emphasize that states can work together, even with different interests.
Through things like diplomacy, institutions, finding common ground.
Exactly. It's not always a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses.
There's potential for mutual benefit.
Right. And they point to things like trade, diplomacy, international law as proof that cooperation is possible.
And wasn't the Concert of Europe itself a kind of example of that?
To some extent, yeah. For a few decades, it worked. The great powers talked, they negotiated, they sometimes even stepped in to stop smaller conflicts from blowing up.
But as we know, it eventually fell apart. And World War I happened.
It did, and this is where liberals might point to the weaknesses of the concert.
It was pretty informal, right? No real teeth.
Exactly. No strong institutions, no way to really enforce agreements.
And it relied too much on the good intentions of the great powers, which, well...
Aren't always so good.
So maybe if there had been something more robust, like a proto-League of Nations, things might have been different?
Possibly. Liberals also emphasize the role of misperceptions and bad decisions.
Like leaders misunderstanding each other, not communicating well, underestimating the risks.
Exactly, which is why diplomacy and transparency are so important to liberals. Build trust, understand each other better, and maybe you avoid those fatal mistakes.
So we've got realism, focusing on power and security, and liberalism saying, hey, cooperation is possible.
And both can help us understand what was happening back then.
Two sides of the same coin, almost.
In a way, yeah. But there's one more theory we got to bring in, one that digs even deeper.
And that's
Constructivism.
back again for our final look at the road to World War I.
We've been using realism and liberalism to try and make sense of it all.
Power, security, cooperation. But now, you said there's this third perspective.
Right, we got to bring in constructivism.
Which, remind me, focuses on?
It says the world isn't just about material stuff like armies and resources.
There's more to it.
Definitely. Ideas matter, perceptions matter, identities matter.
Okay, so like, it's not just how strong a country is, but how it sees itself.
Exactly. And how other countries see it too. These shared understandings, these constructs, they shape everything.
Interesting. Can you give me an example how this played out back then?
Think about nationalism, which was huge in Europe at the time.
Yeah, everyone was super patriotic.
But constructivism says that feeling doesn't just appear out of nowhere.
It's not like inborn or something.
Right. It's constructed, built up over time, a sense of shared identity, a belief in your nation's greatness.
So it's not just that people in, say, Germany all spoke German and liked the same things.
It's that they were taught to see themselves as German, with a capital G, unique, special, maybe even better than others.
And that can obviously lead to rivalry, even hostility between nations.
Of course, we're the best quickly turns into they're a threat.
Which makes conflict more likely.
Exactly. And it's not just nationalism. Other ideas were floating around too, like militarism.
Glorifying war in the military, right?
Yep. And then there's social Darwinism, this idea of survival of the fittest applied to whole nations.
Like the strongest countries deserve to rule.
Basically. So through this constructivist lens, you can see how the world was primed for war.
These beliefs and perceptions created an atmosphere where conflict felt almost inevitable.
Precisely. They shaped how leaders thought, how they reacted to events.
This is really making me rethink how we understand history. You know, It's not just dates and battles.
It's about the ideas behind those events, the beliefs that drive them.
So we've got realism, liberalism, and now constructivism. 3 different ways to view the same period.
And by considering all 3, we get a much more complete picture.
It's like having different tools in a toolbox. You need the right one for the job.
Exactly. Realism for understanding power, liberalism for cooperation, constructivism for the role of ideas.
And these tools aren't just for understanding the past, right?
Oh, they're still relevant today. We still see power struggles, we still see attempts at cooperation, and ideas still matter a lot.
This has been eye-opening, for sure. Makes you realize that the world is complex, and there's no single right answer.
That's the beauty of it. Always more to learn, more to explore.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll be back for more soon.